You might think pirates spent most of their time swinging from the rigging, shouting "air," and burying treasure on sandy islands. But their biggest enemy wasn't enemy ships or the Royal Navy. It was something far less glamorous: their food going bad faster than expected. Let me tell you, when you're out at sea for months with a crew of 50 hungry men, the last thing you want is your dinner turning into a science experiment full of wiggling worms and mysterious green fuzz. And trust me, the solutions they came up with were equal parts brilliant and utterly bonkers. Here's something history books don't often tell you. Pirates had a food preservation problem so serious, it could turn a fearsome crew into a bunch of queasy landlubbers whining about their stomach aches instead of fighting off enemies. You see, on those long voyages, fresh food was a luxury. Pirates relied heavily on salted meat, hardtack biscuits, those bland, rock-hard crackers that are basically edible bricks, and whatever else they could stash below deck. But the problem was, this stuff spoiled and fast. Spoiler alert: the typical preserved pirate food only lasted about 24 to 48 hours in decent condition, once exposed to the humid, salty air. After that, you were basically chewing on a science project in various stages of decay. Now, why was this such a nightmare? Well, imagine 50 pirates each needing at least 2 pounds of meat and 2 quarts of water daily to avoid malnutrition and dehydration. That's a lot to store on a ship that's essentially a floating wooden box tossed around by the Atlantic waves. To make things worse, most pirates' ships, like the infamous Queen Anne's Revenge under Blackbeard, didn't have modern refrigeration or airtight containers. Their storage was often just barrels packed tight in the lower decks where it was damp, dark, and perfect for bacteria and mold to throw a party. These barrels could hold about 63 gallons, packed with salted pork or beef that was supposed to last months, except humidity would get the better of them. Okay, so what did pirates try first? Their earliest attempt was simple but ultimately disastrous: double salting the meat. They figured if one layer of salt kept the meat from going bad, then doubling that layer would make it last twice as long. Bad idea. Really bad idea. Because what they didn't realize is that too much salt actually draws out moisture, but also makes the meat harder and less palatable. Worse, the salty crust sometimes trapped moisture inside the meat, turning it into a soggy breeding ground for bacteria. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation with some soggy pork belly. These super-salted rations were so tough and salty that by the time the crew got around to eating them, it was basically chewing on jerky left in a salt mine. I guess even pirates had moments where they longed for a fresh steak instead of wrestling with meat so salty it could preserve itself and your taste buds permanently. And to make matters worse, some pirates would try soaking the salty meat to make it edible again. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. Waterlogged meat soaked in rancid salt water turned into a smelly mush that nobody dared eat except the hungriest of the crew, who then ended up with dysentery or worse. Because food going bad wasn't the only problem, they had to deal with bugs too. That's right, their barrels were a hotbed for insects and, yes, maggots. While maggots might sound gross, and it is, they actually helped by eating some of the decaying matter, slowing down bacteria. The real issue was that once maggots showed up, no pirate with a shred of dignity or taste buds wanted to eat that meat. Plus, the maggots sometimes burrowed into the wood barrels, breaking them down from the inside, causing spills and attracting rats. Rats, by the way, were another nightmare, because they'd sneak into the food barrels, leaving droppings everywhere, and occasionally gnaw on the precious salted meat. Think of rats as the original food critics who never liked pirate cuisine. So how did pirates try to keep the rats out? Installing traps was considered. Spoiler alert: it didn't work too well because the rats were clever, and there were too many of them on a ship loaded with food and hiding spots. Some crews resorted to keeping cats on board. Yes, actual cats as rodent control. This little-known fact actually helped somewhat because the cats hunted the rats, maintaining a rough balance. Pirates basically had a floating version of an exterminator service, though with a lot more fur and claw marks. Since salted meat wasn't cutting it, and the storage environment was swampy and mold-friendly, pirates thought about drying their food. Drying is an age-old preservation method, right? Sun-drying strips moisture out and kills bacteria. Pirates tried hanging meat strips over fires to dehydrate them. The problem: smoke from the fires, combined with salty air and damp weather, turned the meat into something resembling ancient shoe leather. Sure, it lasted longer, but good luck getting your crew to chow down on what was basically charcoal jerky, while drying increased the shelf life to nearly a month under the right conditions, on the open ocean where humidity often hovered around 70 to 80%. The process was at best only 50% effective. That meant half the meat still ended up feeding the maggots, rats, or worse. The ocean floor. Enter hardtack, the cracker that had a reputation for lasting years but was as enjoyable as chewing on a palm leaf. Pirates stashed these crunchy bricks hoping they'd offer some reliable starch during long voyages. But even hardtack had its quirks. When kept dry, it could survive a full year, which is pretty impressive. However, once exposed to the inevitable dampness of a pirate ship's hold, it quickly turned to a soggy, moldy mess within days. More than a few poor pirates came back from the galley complaining about hardtack with mysterious black spots, which was pirate code for chew at your own peril. It might give you an upset stomach or worse. The irony being, some pirates swore by dipping hardtack in their grog or soup to soften it, accidentally turning it into a breeding ground for bacteria. Because nothing says delicious like biscuits swimming in rum and water goo. Now, imagine all of this before modern microbiology was even a thought. Pirates didn't know about bacteria or mold. They thought spoiled food simply meant the gods are angry or the meat caught a curse. Their understanding was more along the lines of cursed grog giving you bad dreams rather than actual germs. And because of that, every failed preservation method was interpreted as either bad luck or supernatural punishment. This gave rise to plenty of sailor superstitions and bizarre rituals to keep food safe, none of which helped with actually keeping the food edible. Speaking of the gods and curses, here's where it gets fun. Some pirates resorted to flavor masking. When their meat was less fresh and more biologically active, they would cover it with spices or soak it in vinegar or even alcohol to hide the taste. Spoiler alert, it didn't work well. The vinegar only partially masked the rancid flavors, and soaking meat in alcohol sometimes made it soggy and harder to cook. Still, this was the precursor to alcohol as a preservative, which we'll talk about later. Meanwhile, flavor masking reduced the chances of outright refusal of the meal by about 30%. Not great odds when you're feeding a grumpy, mutiny-prone crew. And as if that wasn't enough, pirates had another villain to fight: heat. You'd think the ocean breeze would keep things cool, right? Nope. A pirate ship's hold during the summer could easily hit 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit with nearly 100% humidity. That's basically a perfect incubator for bacteria and mold. Times that by 40 to 60 days at sea, and you get a microbial party that no salt or drying technique could fully prevent. Meat and biscuits would go from edible in a pinch to please make it stop within less than 2 days of storage. Imagine your meal rotting before your eyes while you're stuck hundreds of miles from land. Talk about a confidence killer. Now, the real genius was when some pirate captains experimented with storing food in barrels sealed with pitch, a sticky resin that created a waterproof seal. By coating the inside of barrels with pitch, they could limit air and moisture exposure, which we now know slows down bacterial growth. While not exactly airtight by modern standards, these pitch-coated barrels extended the shelf life of salted meat and hardtack by up to 25%. For pirates, that was like adding an extra 2 to 3 days of edible food to their supplies, which could make the difference between starvation and survival. Captain Henry Morgan's fleet was known to use such barrels during their raids in the Caribbean in the late 1650s. Unfortunately, pitch had a nasty habit of soaking into the food, giving it an unpleasant resinous flavor. Not exactly a Michelin star meal, but beggars can't be choosers. On top of all these tricks, pirates started using alcohol, particularly rum, as an accidental food preservative. The logic was simple. If you can't keep the meat fresh, drown both the meat and your sorrows in strong spirits. Pirates carried barrels of rum not just for drinking, but also for soaking food and even cooking. Turns out, alcohol has antimicrobial properties. It kills bacteria and slows spoilage, which pirates stumbled upon without a clue why. Their version of a food-grade sanitizer, really. While soaking meat in rum only extended the shelf life by about 10 to 15%. It had the added bonus of making the rotten taste more bearable and boosting crew morale during long months at sea. Just imagine a bunch of swashbucklers chugging rum-soaked pork laughing through the nausea. Pretty resourceful for a bunch of lawless scallywags, right? But when pirates got desperate, they also tried freezing meat below deck during winter voyages in the cold North Atlantic. Sounds smart, right? Nope. Ship holds weren't insulated, and the meat froze then thawed repeatedly, which destroyed its texture and made it prone to spoilage once it thawed. Not exactly the ideal seafood restaurant experience. They even tried tossing leftover scraps overboard to keep the holds clean, but this attracted sharks and seagulls, both of which made the ship's decks less safe and dirtier. Food management at sea was a balancing act of preventing spoilage, avoiding infestations, and keeping enough edible supplies to keep a grumpy crew from revolt. And here's a bit of ironic historical trivia for you. Blackbeard, the notorious pirate captain, reportedly kept fresh oranges and limes on his ship during his 1717 voyage. Why? Not because he loved fruit salad, but because these citrus items prevented scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Pirates might have been terrible at preserving meat and biscuits, but they stumbled on the importance of fresh produce to long-term survival. The problem? Citrus didn't keep well itself on board, and supply was limited. Fresh fruit lasted less than a week on deck before becoming mush, so it was a rare luxury rather than everyday fare. So, you see, it wasn't just a lack of skill or luck that made pirate food go bad faster than expected. It was a combination of high humidity, poor storage techniques, microbial warfare, and a deep misunderstanding of the science behind preservation. But don't feel too sorry for them. These failures sparked some of the most inventive preservation experiments at sea. From salted double coatings to soaking meat in rum and the unpleasant but effective pitch barrels. And just between us, the next time you're complaining about your soggy sandwich or fruit gone soft in your lunchbox, remember that pirates were fighting off decades-old proto-mold with nothing but salt, barrels, and a lot of stubborn optimism. Ahoy to that. Now let's talk about the real kicker, water. You might think fresh water was just popping up everywhere on the open sea, spoiler alert. It wasn't. Pirates needed roughly 1 quart of fresh water per person per day, which for a typical crew of 50 meant hauling about 50 quarts daily. That's almost 13 gallons. Multiply that over a 3-month voyage, and suddenly you're looking at nearly 1,200 gallons of fresh water stashed somewhere on a ship smaller than your average yacht. Not exactly a walk in the park. So how did pirates store this precious liquid? Mostly in barrels, just like their meat supplies. And where do you think those barrels lived? That's right, down in the same cramped, damp, and salty belly of the ship where humidity was a permanent resident. Here's the problem. Those barrels weren't airtight. They were wooden, so they absorbed salt spray, and the stoppers were usually wooden plugs or corks soaked in tar to slow down leaks. Not exactly high-tech. Over time, salt water would seep in, turning what should have been freshwater into something closer to aquarium water that not even pet fish would drink. You can probably guess how that ended: parched pirates and growing thirst. Plus, stagnant water in barrels was a magnet for bacteria and algae growth, turning the liquid into something that tasted and looked like swamp juice. Pirates called this dead water, and it was as appetizing as it sounds. Faced with the prospect of drinking rancid, algae-infused water, pirates got creative. One early but ill-fated idea was to boil the water to kill bacteria. Sounds smart, right? Bad idea. Really bad idea. On a ship where your fuel supply was limited and fires were a constant threat, maintaining a boiling pot for hours wasn't practical. Even when they did manage to boil water, they couldn't store it hot, so it cooled back to germ-friendly temperatures fast. So the bacteria's party resumed. Not to mention, the wooden barrels sometimes imparted odd flavors, making steamed water taste like aged pine and salt. Delicious? Not really. Now here's where things get interesting. Pirates accidentally discovered a crude version of water purification through the wise use of alcohol. Because they couldn't drink their own water, they mixed it with rum. Lots of rum. This wasn't just for elation and loosening tongues during long nights, but a life-saving trick. Alcohol kills bacteria and slows down spoilage, so a cocktail of weak grog or watered-down rum helped make water somewhat drinkable. Pirates typically mixed 1 part rum to 4 parts water, creating a potent brew that could keep them hydrated without killing their chances of survival. So, while not exactly the fountain of youth, Rum was basically the 17th century equivalent of a handheld water sterilizer. Consider that next time you complain about your tap water. But relying on rum wasn't perfect either. Drinking too much weakened your fighting skills and left you with morning headaches that were as bad as walking the plank. Plus, when the rum ran out, because it frequently did, pirates had to go back to swigging whatever swamp water was left or resorting to collecting rainwater directly off the sails. Rainwater collection was actually pretty clever when it worked. Pirates rigged tarpaulins and canvas to funnel rain into barrels, and this water was usually fresher than barrel-stored supplies. The catch: rain wasn't reliable, and when storms hit, it was sometimes more like a daring game of water dodging than actual hydration. Not to mention, pirates still had to filter out salt spray and debris that ended up in their rain catchers. So what about fresh food at sea, you ask? Well, fish was the closest thing pirates had to seafood sanity. Ironically, since they were on the water, you'd think catching fish was as routine as breathing. Not quite. Fishing from a rolling ship deck with a 100-foot mast overhead is tricky, and pirate ships weren't exactly equipped with fishing nets or rods like modern fishing boats. Most of their fish came from quick line fishing or opportunistic grabs when the ship was anchored near coasts or islands. When they did catch fish, pirates quickly learned it spoiled faster than their salted pork. Without refrigeration, slimy fish flesh turned rancid in about 12 to 24 hours, especially in hot Caribbean waters. The stench was legendary, and pirates joked it could knock out a rival crew from a mile away. Now, drying fish was an option, using a method called jerking where thin strips were partially smoked and air-dried. While jerky fish could last for weeks, in pirate conditions that meant risking mold and flavor loss. Plus, fish jerky had the unfortunate ability to attract ants and other insects on ship decks, turning your snack into an impromptu buffet for bugs. You might think this would lessen the appeal, but really hungry pirates just shrugged and ate on. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation with a mouthful of crunchy bugs. Another clever but underappreciated preservation technique was fermentation. Pirates sometimes fermented fish or meat in barrels, creating a tangy, sour product that sounds like something from a Viking's grocery list. The idea was that fermentation created an acidic environment hostile to many harmful bacteria. While this preserved the protein longer, the taste was definitely an acquired one. Imagine chewing on shipboard sauerkraut flavored with sea salt and a whiff of rum. Not exactly a five-star meal. Still, fermentation lengthened the shelf life to about a month, roughly doubling what salted meat alone could manage. Few stories survive about pirates flourishing on fermented fish, but it's safe to say the briny stink was a fair trade for avoiding starvation. And you thought mask wearing was a modern invention. Pirates had their own version, sorta. To avoid the foul-mouthed reputation that came with rancid meat, they sometimes rubbed their food with strong-smelling herbs like juniper berries or wild rosemary when available. This wasn't just for flavor but to disguise the telltale scent of decay. While the herbs didn't stop spoilage, they did make dinner slightly less revolting, kind of like adding cologne to a dumpster. During his infamous voyages in the early 1700s, the pirate Calico Jack reportedly insisted on seasonal herb foraging when docked, making his crew's diet marginally less miserable. Not a chef's blessing, but a morale booster nonetheless. We can't talk spoilage without mentioning mold, nature's uninvited roommate on pirate ships. Hardtack, the legendary pirate cracker, was especially loved by mold for its dry, porous nature. When humidity hit the galley, usually a constant 90% or higher, mold spores took to hardtack like lice at a pirate convention. Within days, those crunchy bricks would be coated in everything from fuzzy white to inky black molds. While pirates didn't have microscopes to identify these fungal foes, they knew enough to avoid the worst-looking ones, estimating that about 20% of their hardtack could be safely eaten, and the rest was cursed territory. The hardest part was convincing the crew not to eat the black-spotted pieces, which smelled like old cheese and, unsurprisingly, caused stomach cramps and outright mutiny if forced down. Speaking of mutiny, nothing turned a crew against a captain faster than food poisoning. Outbreaks of dysentery and scurvy were constant threats, both partially fueled by bad food. Pirates discovered early on that rationing played a big role. Too much food rotting at once meant more waste and faster spoilage, So clever captains instituted strict rationing schedules, handing out just enough to keep sailors alive but not so much that spoilage became a nightmare. On a typical ship, each pirate received about 1.5 pounds of salted meat, half a pound of hardtack, and around a quart of grog daily. It wasn't gourmet, but it kept the mutiny count down to manageable levels. Let's appreciate the irony. Pirates excelled at commandeering ships, navigating the seas and wielding cutlasses, but were spectacularly lousy at keeping their meals fresh. Every failed preservation technique was a wartime experiment in biochemistry, albeit without the benefit of a lab or a helpful YouTube tutorial. Their resilience and constant trial and error ultimately paved the way for better naval provisioning in the centuries that followed. Modern sailors can thank them for lessons learned, and for giving us stories of rotten meat and buggy biscuits that still make us cringe. So next time you open your lunch and find that one sad soggy corner on your sandwich, think about the brave pirates who had to choke down barrels of bacteria soup and rum-soaked mystery, meat to keep their bellies full, and their spirits hanging on between gunfights. Food rotting faster than expected was less a culinary disaster and more a survival challenge wrapped in salt and sweat. And despite all odds, these salty sea dogs ate, fought, and lived to tell the tale. Ahoy to that stubborn hunger and even stubbier food preservation. Alright, so pirates had their barrels of meat and hardtack turning into biohazard zones, but the real kicker, water. You might think fresh water is just everywhere on the ocean. Newsflash, it's not. 50 pirates needed at least 50 quarts of fresh water each day. That's nearly 13 gallons. Multiply that across a 2 to 3 month voyage, and suddenly you're hauling close to 1,200 gallons of the stuff on a ship barely big enough to swing a cutlass. Where does all that water live? You guessed it, in barrels shoved deep in the dark, salty, damp belly of a wooden box bobbing on unpredictable oceans. Think of it like stuffing your kitchen pantry with gallons of milk left out on a summer day, but worse because there's no refrigerator and little chance to air things out. Here's the first problem. Those barrels weren't airtight. Made of wood with stoppers soaked in tar or pitch to fight leaks, they still absorbed saltwater spray, turning your precious freshwater into something vaguely reminiscent of aquarium sludge. Pirates called this dead water. And dead water was every bit as appetizing as it sounds. Greenish, slimy, sometimes buzzing with who knows what living inside. You can probably guess how that ended. Dehydration wasn't just unpleasant, it was a death sentence. Pirates were desperate to keep any kind of clean water on board, but bacteria, algae, and salty sea waves had other plans. So what did they try first? Boiling the water. Sounds smart. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Maintaining a rolling pot of boiling water on a rocking wooden ship with limited wood or coal fuel was like playing with fire, literally. The crews risked burning down the ship more than killing germs. Even if they did manage to boil their barrels full of swamp water, it cooled down quickly once taken off the fire, creating a perfect cozy environment for bacteria to come back strong. Plus, the barrels themselves sometimes made the water taste like pine needles dumped into a campfire. Talk about ruining your next swig. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirates stumbled on a crude but somewhat effective water purification method purely by accident. Rum. Yep, that demon drink wasn't just for fueling drunken sword fights and loosened stitches. It was a makeshift antiseptic. Alcohol kills bacteria and slows the nasty microbial party. Pirates mixed what they called grog, usually 1 part rum to 4 parts water, turning gross, dead water into drinkable liquid with a bite strong enough to make your head spin, but at least safe enough to keep you alive. It's basically their version of a handheld water treatment plant, or what we jokingly call a pirate-flavored sanitizing solution. Plus, it helped morale, because nothing says all hands on deck like fancy pirate cocktails at gunpoint. But when the rum barrels ran dry, which often happened after 1 or 2 fierce battles or celebratory binge sessions, pirates were forced to drink the dreaded swamp juice again or get creative. Some ships rigged tarps and canvas sails to collect rainwater, funneling it into barrels. Now that's smart. Think of it as primitive but effective rainwater harvesting. The catch? Rain was, of course, unpredictable, and storms sometimes made collecting rainwater more of a spill-your-coffee-again moment. Plus, the rainwater still needed filtering for salt spray and debris, which was challenging without modern filters. so pirates might drink a bucketful of questionable rain, hoping it tasted better than their barrel sludge. Okay, so we talked about meat going bad, biscuits turning into moldy bricks, and water turning into swampy nightmares. What about fresh food? Now you'd think being surrounded by water would make fish a pirate's best friend. Spoiler alert, it wasn't that simple. Fishing from a rocking deck with a 100-foot mast overhead requires some skill, gear, and patience, luxuries pirates didn't always have. Most fish came from quick line fishing or opportunistic grabs when anchored near coasts or islands. But here's the rub. Once caught, fish spoiled even faster than meat, about 12 to 24 hours max, especially in those tropical Caribbean temps with searing sun and 70 to 80% humidity. The smell, legendary. Pirates joked it could knock out enemy sailors from miles away. Talk about weaponizing your lunch. Drying fish by jerking, partially smoking, and air drying thin strips was on the menu, but humidity and salty air teamed up to ruin the process. The fish either got soggy and moldy or turned into such leathery chew toys that only the most desperate pirates dared try eating them. Plus, dried fish attracted ants and bugs all over the deck, turning your rations into an insect buffet. Because nothing says fearsome pirate like crunching on fish jerky filled with crunchy wings and tiny legs. Pirates just shrugged and called it extra protein, probably choking down their bug-infested bites with the help of more rum. And then there was fermentation. Pirates borrowed this trick from cultures far and wide, fermenting fish or meats in barrels to create acidic environments inhospitable to bad bacteria. This extended food life to about a month, roughly doubling the shelf life of salted meat. Think of it as their version of sauerkraut but way fishier and with a hefty splash of salt and rum. The taste? Well, less than gourmet. Imagine chewing on sour, salty maritime kimchi infused with barnacles and a pirate's sweat. Not exactly a Michelin star dish, but it kept them alive, which counts for a lot on a ship where rancid food could end your voyage abruptly. Thinking pirates just ate gross food up front. No, they got creative with herbal disguises too. When herb supplies allowed, pirate cooks rubbed rancid meat or stale hardtack with strong-smelling plants like juniper berries or wild rosemary harvested during land stops. This was pirates' version of mouthwash, hiding the olfactory horror behind a mask of pine and spice. While it didn't keep the meat from spoiling, it made eating slightly less of a daredevil stunt. Calico Jack, the infamous pirate from the early 1700s, was known to send crews ashore for herb foraging, partially to avoid mutiny fueled by the smell of decay and desperation. Because nothing kills pirate morale faster than elderberry-scented doom coming from the galley. Let's not forget the uninvited roommates, mold and mildew. Hardtack, that legendary biscuit, was basically a magnet for mold spores as soon as humidity pushed past 80%. Pirates' holds were like a fungal paradise with spores turning those crunchy bricks into fuzzy black, sometimes pink colonies in just days. Pirates didn't have microscopes, but they sure knew which biscuits looked like they'd been hosting a fungal rave. They'd estimate that only about 20% of their hardtack was safe to eat. The rest was labeled cursed, and rightly so. The grossest pieces smelled like old cheese and caused stomach cramps that pushed crews dangerously close to mutiny. For pirates, the line between dinner and disaster was a moldy crumb away. Food poisoning. Mutiny fuel number 1. Outbreaks of scurvy and dysentery due to bad food and water were so common that captains treated rationing like part strategy, part dance with death. They'd dole out about 1.5 pounds of salted meat, half a pound of hardtack, and roughly a quart of grog daily per man. Not gourmet, but enough to keep mutiny mostly at bay. More food meant more spoilage. Less food meant grumpy, hungry pirates. It was a tightrope walk with a lot of spilled grog and broken cutlasses. Like an early version of portion control meets crisis management. The irony: pirates were brilliant sailors and ruthless fighters, but abysmally bad at feeding themselves fresh, nutritious food. Each failed preservation experiment was like a trial by fire in fermentation science or microbial warfare, without the benefit of microscopes or YouTube tutorials. Their stubborn trial and error paved the way for modern naval provisioning and preservation techniques. Modern sailors owe some respect to those salty, stubborn sea dogs who fought not just sea monsters and navies, but their own dinner disasters. And here's a finishing bite for you. Despite all their food failures, Pirates somehow understood the importance of fresh produce. Blackbeard, that legendary terror from 1717, is credited with carrying fresh oranges and limes on his voyages, not for flavor, but to prevent scurvy, the dreaded vitamin C deficiency disease. Fresh citrus only lasted about a week aboard ship before turning to mush, so it was a rare treasure among salt and rot. The fact that pirates had this knowledge is pretty astonishing given their general food track record. They may have been terrible at math or sanitation, but they learned that a tiny fruit could mean the difference between life and death. So next time your lunch feels a bit meh, or your sandwich turns soggy, give a thought to those pirates choking down barrels of maggoty pork, moldy crackers, and algae-infused swamp water while plotting to take over the Caribbean. Food going bad faster than expected wasn't just bad luck or bad taste. It was a survival puzzle wrapped in salt, sweat, and seasickness. Their stinky, itchy, sometimes barely edible meals were less culinary disasters and more a grim dance with fate. And yet these hardened sea wolves ate, fought, and still conquered oceans. Ahoy to that stubborn hunger and the culinary horrors that came with it.